So this unit, any images that you see on any of those pictures I posted on Canvas, you'll go see those exact same images on the study guide and as well on the test. So make sure you get comfortable with those because you'll be answering some questions about those. You don't have to memorize any of these things. You're just going to be answering questions about them. So you have to know how they work, what they mean, stuff like that. All right, so first off, let's talk about what ATP is. ATP is basically a little tiny battery that you have probably trillions of in your body right now. And they are, every living cell in the earth, as far as I know, uses ATP to basically power their biological processes. Now, this unit's the muscle unit, so we're mainly talking about how ATP powers your muscles, allows them to move, but every other thing in the body uses this as well. So it stands for adenosine triphosphate. Tri meaning 3, phosphate meaning 3 phosphate groups down here. You also have another molecule that's important, adenosine diphosphate, that has 2 phosphates. Okay, so this shouldn't be too confusing. Diphosphate has 2, triphosphate has 3. Now, triphosphate is kind of unstable. It's got a lot of extra energy compared to diphosphate. So there are 3 ways we make ATP, and we're going to talk about that. So 3 ways we make this molecule, which is used to, once again, power your muscles, but everything else in the body as well. If you ran out of ATP right now in your body, you would basically cease to exist because your brain would stop working. All right, so let's talk about the way you were taught in biology. So if your biology teacher didn't want to go in great detail on cell respiration, you were probably taught this. You breathe in oxygen and you put out CO2. So you take glucose and oxygen. Here's the equation down here. Aerobic respiration, called cell respiration in biology. So you're taking glucose and oxygen, you put out CO2 and H2O, and we get 36 ATP. So that's what you were taught in biology, but there's actually 2 other ways that muscles can make ATP. There's one other way every cell in the body can do it, and that's through anaerobic respiration. So let's imagine you don't have oxygen. So no matter what, your glucose starts out the same way. It goes through a process called glycolysis, it's turned into pyruvate, but here's where it can differentiate depending on if you have oxygen or you don't. So what's a scenario where you just don't have oxygen? Well, that's pretty common. Let's say you are out of shape and you climbed up a flight of stairs and you're starting to be winded. Anytime you're breathing heavily or you're winded, you do not have enough oxygen in your body. Therefore, you will start to go through the anaerobic pathway called anaerobic respiration, more commonly called anaerobic glycolysis. Okay, but in this class, we're just going to call it anaerobic respiration. So that's a scenario. Let's say anytime you're winded, you're definitely going through this pathway. Anytime, let's say you're holding your breath underwater, you're going through that pathway as well. Now, for one glucose molecule, we only get 2 ATP out of this process. So this process will not keep you alive. Your brain requires way too much ATP for this to keep you alive. So unfortunately, even though you can do this in your muscles for a long time, your brain simply can't handle it. Now, what's the downside of this? The downside is it's inefficient. 1 glucose molecule, 2 ATP. Highly inefficient. And we produce this nasty byproduct, lactic acid. Okay, you'll see it says ethyl alcohol and CO2. This is in plants and yeast and stuff like that. We do not produce ethyl alcohol and CO2. That would be bad. Basically, if you were low on oxygen, you would be getting drunk the entire time. That would not be a good adaptation, obviously. But we do produce this nasty stuff called lactic acid. This stuff will change the acidity of your cells and your blood. It'll make you nauseous, and it makes your muscles less efficient. It makes all those enzymes less efficient at doing their job. So the more lactic acid you produce, basically the slower and slower you're going to get. Let's say you're playing a 3-hour soccer game or something like that. The more this you produce, the slower and slower you're going to get. You're going to start getting more negative feedbacks off that. So if you're out of shape, it's really easy to run out of oxygen. Anytime you're winded, that could be, for some people, that could be, walking up 1 flight of stairs, they could get winded. So they're using anaerobic respiration, and they're producing this nasty lactic acid. Now, a more efficient process is to have oxygen. So to say you're in shape. Well, how do you get more in shape? Basically, we see that part of this process requires mitochondria and oxygen. So this does require oxygen and mitochondria. So when people get more in shape, and we've already talked about this a little bit in some of the past lessons, the basic idea is that you have more mitochondria, especially in your slow twitch muscles, and you have more capillaries, little blood vessels in your muscles. So if you can get more oxygen and you have more mitochondria and you have more red blood cells, that's another thing. Someone who's really in shape typically has more red blood cells in their body. then you'll be able to do more aerobic respiration. And what does that mean? Well, anaerobic, we only get, per glucose, we only get 2 ATP, and we get this nasty lactic acid that slows us down. But if we can do aerobic, 1 glucose gets us 36 yield ATP, which is pretty good. We get CO2 and H2O. CO2 is not necessarily dangerous for us. We actually need to have some in our blood at all times. So this is the ideal situation. Why is this bad? This is bad because it requires mitochondria and it requires oxygen, which, we're breathing in oxygen constantly, but getting it down to our muscles is no small feat. So that's kind of the downside with aerobic respiration, is even though it's more efficient, it's a little slower, and it requires a lot of extra steps. So you can see here it requires 2 additional biological processes, and each one of these has like 10 to 30 steps in it. If you want to learn that, take AP Bio next year. Now, we'll see that anaerobic respiration, I have fast twitch written here. That doesn't mean that fast twitch only gets its ATP from anaerobic. It just means it gets the majority of its ATP from anaerobic. And slow twitch gets the majority of its ATP from aerobic. What's the difference here? Well, I have read multiple times that your strongest fast twitch muscles can have as few as like 5 mitochondria, versus your slow twitch muscles can have over 1,000 mitochondria. So pretty distinct difference between how these things can make ATP. Now, you actually have a third way we make ATP, but only found in muscles. And it's called the creatine phosphate shuffle. If you've heard of creatine before, it's a popular workout supplement. It actually does work. There's a million products you can get on Amazon and stuff like that that doesn't work. This one actually has some credence to it. It has been proven in studies, good studies done by colleges, not by companies trying to sell you something, that it does work. And it makes sense how it works, because if I take this in my diet, this protein, you can build up this thing called creatine phosphate. And the way this works is very simple, okay? Creatine phosphate has an extra phosphate. Adenosine diphosphate, as we can tell up here, needs an extra phosphate. So this molecule and this molecule can easily come together to quickly make ATP. So how does that work? Creatine phosphate simply donates its phosphate group to ADP to create ATP. And what are we left with? We're left with creatine by itself, which can be reused, and ATP, which is what we want to begin with. Now, there's got to be a downside to this, right? The downside is very simple. Creatine phosphate has to be physically stored in the muscles. This isn't something you store in your blood or anything like that. So it only lasts about 6 to 10 seconds. Assuming you're taking off at a top speed sprint, you're going to run out of this stuff extremely fast, and then you have to rest and basically let these creatine phosphate stores be built back up with aerobic respiration. So you can see that if you're running like a 5K or a 10K or something like that, you're really not going to use this unless you're running uphill or sprinting at the end. All right, let's look at the last thing on here. The last thing is basically saying, and this chart's not perfect, okay? This is more of like a theoretical situation here. This is saying where are you getting your energy from? Which one of these sources? There's 4 sources. We have stored ATP, creatine phosphate, aerobic, and anaerobic respiration, okay? So let's imagine you're running for your life from a bear or something like that. Your stored ATP is going to drop to 0 pretty much instantaneously. Okay, you don't have enough room for a lot of stored ATP. Not to mention, it's a pretty unstable molecule, so you're not going to have hours of that stored up. And then creatine phosphate, you're going to get the peak of your energy from creatine phosphate after a couple seconds, and then that's going to run out. We said about 6 to 10 seconds later, assuming you're running for your life. Now, what's going to slowly start making your energy? The anaerobic pathway we can see is where you're going to get the majority of your energy from for quite a long time. If you're running for your life or you're running for a 5 or 10K, you can actually get the majority of your ATP from anaerobic respiration. The problem occurs is that you're building up lactic acid that whole time. So if the athletic event you're doing is longer than 30 minutes to an hour, say a football game or a soccer game, chances are, even though you're using all 3 pathways, depending on the situation, sprinting, something like that, if it's over about an hour, or even 30 minutes for most people, you're getting the majority of your energy from aerobic respiration. And that makes sense because anaerobic is so inefficient. There's no way we could run for several hours using solely the anaerobic pathway. It's just going to burn through our glucose stores, and it's going to produce so much lactic acid we're going to have to stop and puke and slow down. But the aerobic pathway can basically be used until you die. And how do we know that? Because I'm using it right now, and you're using this pathway right now as well. So how do I know if I'm using aerobic respiration versus anaerobic? I've already mentioned it. If you are breathing heavily, if you're out of breath, you're using this pathway. It doesn't mean you're not using this pathway too. It just means you're using this pathway for sure. How do you know you're using creatine phosphate? Basically, if you're contracting as many muscles as possible, and you're giving it 100%, you're definitely burning into this creatine. And you can tell because no matter what you do, no matter how much weight you lift, no matter how fast you sprint, you will slow down in about 6 to 10 seconds. Will it be noticeable? Yeah, you will have a noticeable loss of speed in about 6 to 10 seconds when that creatine phosphate store runs out, assuming you had it built up to begin with. It's possible you were already kind of fatigued in that area. All right, guys, I'm going to post this along with some questions about these two. The questions I post, they don't say creatine phosphate shuffle. They say it's kind of a long, drawn-out way to say it. The questions say the coupled reaction of creatine phosphate and ADP, which we did discuss, but we're going to call it the creatine phosphate shuffle. That is kind of the common term for this cycle right here, where we make ADP, we make creatine phosphate, we make ADP, that gets used, stuff like that. All right, so these are going to be your questions. I will post a picture of those. Make sure you answer these. They each have one answer except for requires no oxygen. Remember, there's 2 of these 3 processes that do not require oxygen. And then number 9, some students had trouble with good for a sprint. This answer can be different depending on how long you consider a sprint. So let's consider the sprint to be, 40 meters or something like that. All right, and I will talk to y'all guys later.